To introduce this topic of boundaries, I offer you a short story from my misspent youth. A couple of nights before the start of my senior year in high school, I was hanging out with some friends. They were actually church friends. It was very late at night, and we were too young to participate in bars or nightlife, and we were looking for something to do. Somehow, one of us had the not-so-smart idea to steal various street signs and lawn ornaments. The whole thing started very timidly and small, but we got braver as the items went along, probably 5 or 6 in total. A very juvenile idea culminated in being in a car chase, followed by one of the victims of our theft. We foolishly thought that we had lost him. Until the very next day, the police arrived at my friend's house, the same house where we had been hanging out the evening before. Fortunately, they were gentle. This was one of the countless times in my life where I am deeply aware that my skin color and class privilege saved my behind. With the police escorting us, we returned all the items and offered heartfelt apologies, and it was all good. Until word got back to our parents. And it's way more elaborate and even more embarrassing than I have time to tell in this sermon, fortunately. My punishment was reasonable. I was grounded for a few weeks, and for a few months, it became my job picking up dog poop in the backyard. This is 2 very large dogs in a very small backyard. It's not insignificant. The punishment was reasonable. It was upheld. My friend, however, was told that his punishment would be much harsher. He would be grounded for 6 months. He would lose access to his car, and this speaks volumes. His credit card would be taken away. Those reactionary punishments seemed very extreme in our world, but his actual punishment lasted about a week. Meanwhile, my grounding continued, as did the backyard pickup schedule. Most of what I learned from that ordeal, beyond the fact that boredom is the breeding ground for bad ideas, most of what I learned was about my parents. I learned that they were reasonable and that they meant what they said. And I wondered what it was like for my friend growing up in this sort of herky-jerky parenting style. He was showered with privilege and praise one minute, and it was jerked away the next, but just for a minute. While in some ways being spoiled that way is easier, I appreciated knowing where I stood in my family. Whether it's raising children or relating to our partners or in our work environment, setting boundaries and following through lets those around us know where we all stand. Boundaries help children see that there's a loving structure to keep them safe. Children may not always agree with the rules. Workplace expectations may seem boring and restrictive, but having some guidelines carves out some safety and structure in an otherwise chaotic world. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke about the 4 chambers of the heart. They're basically different ways of exercising courage. The 4th chamber, the strong heart, is about having the strength and security to express who you are clearly without apology. And in that sermon, I invited people to consider where in their lives their heart was strong and where in their own lives it was not so strong. As we talk about boundaries, I encourage a similar approach. This isn't about some people being total pushovers and some people being rigid jerks. More likely, each of us have areas in our life where we clearly express our needs. Yet in other areas, we may find it very difficult to say no, or to say, this is what I need, or this is what I don't want to happen. So for today, you might hold in mind those places in life where it isn't so easy to draw the line. As I was thinking about it this week, I realized there's a benefit that we don't often think about with boundaries. It's about preserving mental and emotional energy. If every moment of every relationship is up for debate, we have little capacity to accomplish anything else. That may mean having clear expectations with your 5-year-old around mealtime and dessert, or a set routine for getting to bed, instead of debating with a tiny terrorist for hours every night. Having a predictable structure saves everyone that agony. It can be more complicated with adults, though. In our adult relationships, our goals and interests are never in 100% alignment. In our adult relationships, as individuals, our goals are never 100% in alignment. Usually that's not a big deal. We can compromise about what we're going to have for dinner. But sometimes the alignment issues are bigger. Sometimes we feel called in directions that are really challenging to each other. Sometimes we run up to a limit to what we can give, even something really important that the other person is asking for, like time or intimacy. Rather than always being in that gnawing zone on the edge of disappointment and confusion, we set some boundaries and expectations. This is what I can do. This is what I need. And communicating those clearly, coming to understand them together, saves our hearts and minds from endless rehashing and compromise. Boundaries provide a sort of emotional efficiency, for lack of a better word. So, how many of us are always the best version of ourselves? Not many of us, right? And how many of you have worked hard to change a piece of yourself? I imagine most of us, yeah? And it's not easy. It was a whole heck of a lot of work, and it may not have even been successful yet. Setting boundaries isn't about trying to change another person. Trying to change another person is a fool's errand. You can offer to walk with them supportively if they're seeking to change themselves, but don't expect to change someone else who isn't seeking that change for themselves. Do you know how hard it is to change your own habits, or to pursue healthier relationships, or to mend your heart? All of those changes take tremendous work. If we're lucky, we find someone to encourage us along our own path. And we can offer ourselves to support others in encouragement for their change, but we can't set the journey for them. It seems almost irresponsible or impossible to preach a sermon about boundaries without mentioning Al-Anon. Some of you are probably very familiar, and for some of you this is a totally new word. Al-Anon is a sister program to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's for people who are worried about someone with a drinking problem. Similarly, Nar-Anon is a 12-step program for friends and family members of people affected by addiction. These two organizations get a lot less airtime than AA, but their work is transformative and has saved countless families. Recognizing that it's not possible to change another person who doesn't want to, Al-Anon is not so much about saving another person from their addiction. It's much more about creating loving boundaries with someone who struggles. And if they're seeking recovery, how to accompany them on that journey. So if you or someone you know is struggling with a relationship with someone experiencing addiction, I cannot recommend Al-Anon highly enough as a resource. One last nuance that I want to mention about boundaries is a sort of grain of salt. There's a limitation to this word that I keep saying, boundaries. It suggests something very solid and innate and some immovable barrier. But we are living, breathing human beings, changing every minute. If the past 15 years have taught me anything, it's that I continue to grow and learn in ways that I never anticipated. Yes, some boundaries may be hard and fast, but it's worth exploring them with an open mind until you're really sure. At first, avoid drawing those lines in the sand. When setting boundaries with another person, instead of yes or no questions, try more open-ended questions that help everyone talk through what they're thinking. I guess you could say, seek to understand as much as to be understood. And understanding does not mean agreeing. But you have to understand what the other person is putting on the table before you can rightfully turn it down. Now, this is admittedly an odd sermon. We don't talk much in Unitarian Universalism about saying no. In fact, there's a whole hymn, "Tell Them I Said Yes to Life." It's a wonderful hymn. We much more often focus on compassion and giving. There are limits, though, and they're baked right into our 7 principles. This is a little bit of a challenging one. Anyone remember what our second principle is? Yes, that is the children's version, and that's wonderful. Someone in here taught RE. It's justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships. Justice and equity both depend on knowing some limits and insisting on basic fairness. 5th principle, more people know. That's the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. The use of the democratic process can be a tricky thing for us to understand sometimes. We get the first part of it, that everyone gets a vote. We celebrate that well. But the other part is that everyone gets just one vote. One vote per person. No matter how much of a fuss an individual raises, no matter how deeply held his or her convictions, they get only one vote. It's up to the community to decide together in an equal manner how to govern itself. And a democratic community, in turn, says no to a smaller group who disagrees with the results of a vote. Functional democracy depends on an ability to say no in a way that's not dismissive or oppressive or rude. And then there's the 7th principle, the one that we all remember. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. That final principle, the one that guides most of our faith tradition, is all about recognizing our relationships. And healthy relationships don't dissolve individuals. Healthy relationships nurture each person, each being, encouraging them to thrive into their best self. There is room in this big, beautiful world for that kind of flourishing to happen if we recognize some boundaries along the way. In her opening remarks, Joanne kind of hinted a little bit at resentment and the importance of saying no when resentment starts to bubble up. It's one of those red flags Resentment is a quietly destructive emotion that can grow really like a cancer if you allow it to. And if saying yes builds more and more resentment, it's probably time to include that little 2-letter word in your vocabulary. Too many yes dears is not a good idea. If you really do mind, then say something. And that includes here at Tapestry. We ask a lot of our members, and most people in this community are incredibly generous with time and money. Many of you give in ways that are really, honestly, incredibly inspiring to me. But I don't want anyone to resent their spiritual home. I don't want anyone to resent the number of hours they spend on a project, or the physical effort something takes, or the money that they give. Now, we all know that we get a little bit of pleasure out of complaining about things that aren't that big of a deal, and a little bit of that is okay. But if there is serious resentment about what you're giving to support Tapestry, slow down. When you begin to resent your giving, it's time to reevaluate, maybe even time to say no. So probably the simplest version of communicating boundaries is that very important 2-letter word. When you're asked for more, sometimes the right answer is no. Ideally, though, it's not your first response, either spoken or thought. This is a sermon about drawing reasonable boundaries to preserve your sense of self, not about shutting out the world. While we deepen our sense of self, it's important to live our lives with a sense of openness and opportunity. It's a way of practicing hope, saying yes to life. Like any practice, it's something that takes effort to do over and over until it becomes natural. With pretty much all the world around you ready to say no, let our goal be, when we can, to greet new opportunities and ideas with a yes. Amen.